Good evening and welcome you to this year's Boyle lecture. I do so at the threshold of a year which marks for us at St Mary Le Bow 50 years since the rebuilding and reconsecration of the church after a near total loss in May 1941. We have a number of celebrations in planning, of which this rightly is the first. The prevailing architectural and social orthodoxy after the war was against such a reconstruction, and it very nearly didn't happen. Today, many recall this restored church for the seemingly singular device of two pulpits. In itself, just one of the revivals of the liturgical movement, which idiom probably rescued the restorers, and which movement gripped the historic churches from the 1920s onwards and sought to restore something of the conditions of worship of the earliest Christian communities. Thus, ambos, not pulpits, for the declamation of the epistle, south, and the gospel, north. Yet my predecessor, but three, Joseph McCulloch, whose likeness you can see at the top of the arch there, a mercurial and talented figure, to say the least, famously used these pulpits to create here a tradition of dialogue by which the wisdom of the church would be tested by the luminaries of the age against the prevailing currents of thought. Well, it hardly sounds like a wild project, but was considered very innovative then and later. It is a sound principle, and one that has been recurrent in 50 years of activity here. The Boyle lectures and their revival fit into this tradition of dialogue in a manner which requires little explanation, and of which, as we celebrate, we are indeed proud. Dialogue may be a contributory factor in our self-description here as propagators of reasonable religion, a potentially lazy label about which more from our lecturer later. But this project has assuredly proved a masterly collaboration with many resonances. Each lecturer gives unstintingly. In Professor McGrath's case, this does not remotely surprise me, as I recall sitting in the shadows as a raw freshman more than 30 years ago as he debated fluently with our very donnish dean. The worshipful company of Mercers, whose hall is in the parish, have embraced the Boyle lecture from the outset, and their support is handsomely displayed in the arrangements for tonight. The Grocers' Company have also been unfailingly generous throughout, together with other supporters, including Gresham College. Tonight's proceedings will be available in print as you leave and on our website shortly. To introduce tonight's lecturer and the vote of thanks, I am pleased to hand over to the lecturer's able, indefatigable, and stalwart convener, and the parish's very great friend, Dr. Michael Byrne. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to echo George's welcome to this, the 11th Boyle Lecture of the new series, and to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Alistair McGrath. In making arrangements for the original series of Boyle Lectures in 1691, shortly before his death, Robert Boyle charged those delivering the lectures that they were to be used, and I quote, for proving the Christian religion against notorious infidels, atheists, theists, pagans, Jews, and Mohammedans, but that they were not to descend lower by dealing with any controversies that are among Christians themselves. I found myself thinking of these famous words last month on a visit to Jerusalem. There, after a morning of wandering in the Old City and noting the clear boundaries between the Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Armenian quarters, I went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the main Christian shrine within the city. This being Jerusalem, I wasn't expecting to find a quiet and peaceful space, but even I was taken aback to find the division of the church into such strictly segregated Christian subgroups: Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, Coptic Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, and Syriac Orthodox, among others. Tensions between the rival Christian groups run high at times, with fistfights and other brawls an occasional occurrence. And the physical boundaries between the different Christian groups within the Church are even more sharply patrolled than those between Christians, Muslims, and Jews in the city outside. Perhaps Robert Boyle was right to injunct his lecturers not to descend into any intra-Christian disputes. And part, at least, of the hope of this series is that in reflecting on the relationship between theology and the sciences, we may search for, and perhaps even find, understanding that binds us together across some of the divides of human inquiry, rather than continuing to focus on the things that separate us. Our lecturer this evening, Alistair McGrath, holds a chair in theology, ministry, and education at King's College London, and is head of that college's Centre for Theology, Religion, and Culture. As such, he of all people will surely have a strong sense of the boundary issues that I mentioned above and how they might be overcome. He was previously Professor of Historical Theology at the University of Oxford and was also Principal of Wycliffe Hall, Oxford, until 2004. Professor McGrath studied and taught at Cambridge University and is an ordained priest of the Church of England, where he ministers in a group of parishes in the Cotswolds. Alistair McGrath holds no fewer than 3 doctorates from the University of Oxford: a DPhil in molecular biophysics, a doctorate of divinity and historical and systematic theology, and a doctorate of letters, awarded for research in science and religion. Unable to stay away from the site of such academic success, Alistair will return to Oxford to take up the Andreas Idrios Professorship of Science and Religion and the directorship of the Ian Ramsey Centre in April of this year. With such a distinguished lecturer, we are fortunate in having a no less distinguished proposer of the vote of thanks to Alistair McGrath for this evening's lecture. Lord Harries of Pentragarth was Bishop of Oxford from 1987 until 2006 and is now a very active member of the House of Lords. He was previously Dean of King's College London, where he is a Fellow and an Honorary Professor of Theology. He is also an Honorary Fellow of Selwyn College, Cambridge, and of St Anne's College, Oxford. As Bishop of Oxford, Lord Harries was Chairman of the Church of England Board for Social Responsibility and Chairman of the Council of Christians and Jews. He has, among other appointments, also been a board member of Christian Aid, a member of the Royal Commission on the Reform of the House of Lords, the Wakeham Commission, and a founder member of the Abrahamic Group in Oxford. The Boyle Lectureship has been remarkably fortunate over the years in attracting distinguished lecturers and responders, and never more so than this evening. As such, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Alistair McGrath and invite him to deliver the 2014 Boyle Lecture on New Atheism, New Apologetics, the Use of Science in Recent Christian Apologetic Writings.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is a very great pleasure to be able to deliver the 2014 Boyle Lecture. And in doing so, I'm conscious of standing in the shadows of some great figures in both the immediate and the more distant past. The Boyle Lectures, delivered over the period 1692 to 1732, are widely regarded as one of the most significant public demonstrations of the reasonableness of Christianity in the early modern period, characterized by that era's growing emphasis on the importance of a rational defense of faith and an increasing suspicion of ecclesiastical authority. Intellectual and cultural historians are increasingly appreciating the importance of what is often known as the Augustan Age in shaping modern attitudes towards science and religion. Now, the first series of Boyle Lectures, delivered in 1692 by Richard Bentley, were devoted to what he called a confutation of atheism. And I thought it might be interesting to make a connection with our own times and to consider some issues in the field of science and religion which are highlighted by the rise of what we have come to term, for better or worse, the new atheism. The phrase is perhaps unhelpful in that most of the ideas associated with this movement are far from being new. I think what is genuinely new about this movement is not so much its intellectual outlook, but its tone of engagement. As has often been pointed out within scholarly assessments of the movement, its novelty value lies primarily in the aggressive rhetoric on the one hand and its unpleasant tendency to focus its polemic against religious people rather than against religious ideas. Now, it's not my intention to engage the ideas of the new atheism in this lecture. This has already been done by so many people in so many ways that it seems pointless to add further to an increasingly tired and stale discussion. My intention, rather, is to explore how the assertion of epistemological priority and privileges on the part of the natural sciences by leading new atheist writers such as Richard Dawkins has been reflected in the way in which Christian apologetics has deployed recognizably scientific strategies and working assumptions in responding to them. Now, this is not about science versus religion, although it suits the purposes and agendas of some to present it as such. As we will see, it is fundamentally about competing interpretations of science and diverging applications of the scientific method. As I think many of you know, I began my academic career as a scientist, studying chemistry at Oxford University and then researching in the biological sciences at Oxford under Professor Sir George Rader. And this immersion in a scientific research culture is meant to shape minds and patterns of thought, and it certainly shaped mine. As I look back on my own intellectual development, I can see 4 points at which Oxford scientific culture had a decisive impact on my own approach to thinking and to writing. First, I absorbed an emphasis on clarity of writing and presentation. Opaque, ambivalent, highly nuanced forms of speech were to be avoided, in that they constituted a barrier to grasping your methods, your results, and your interpretations. I remain suspicious of the habit that some theologians seem to regard as some kind of intellectual virtue, namely, apparently hiding behind words. And I take particular pleasure in the writings of those who aim for clarity of expression and formulation. After taking advice, the first Christian theologian I read seriously was Karl Barth. And he persuaded me that theology could indeed be taken seriously by a scientist. I often wonder, I must confess, what might have happened if I had begun my reading elsewhere. But happily, other theologians I studied reinforced this impression, most notably Thomas F. Torrance and Austin Farrow. Second, an evidence-based approach to argument is now hardwired into my soul and is reflected in the fundamental questions that I ask as a theologian. Why should someone think this? How might they be shown to be wrong? What evidence underlies your position? And it seems to me that the capacity to assemble a well-ordered evidential argument is one of the most important skills that any scientist can develop. And I think I must insist that theologians must learn from this, And I intend no disrespect, but I am unhappy about the tendency I see in some theologians to assert rather than to argue, to appeal to an authority rather than evidence, without providing reasons for those assertions or anticipating objections and alternatives. It seems to me that more theologians need to take seriously the intellectual discipline of evidence-based thinking, not least in engagement with the public domain. A third habit of thought that I picked up during my time as a scientist is related to this. The core question that many of my philosophical colleagues want to ask about an idea is this: is it reasonable? I've always balked at that. This seems to me to be a surefire way of locking us into some form of rationalism which allows reason to determine what can be right, and thus imprisons the scientific enterprise within a rationalist straitjacket. The fundamental question a scientist is going to ask is not, is this reasonable, but rather, what are the reasons for thinking this is true? We can't lay down in advance what rationality is characteristic of the universe. We have to find out by letting the universe tell us, or figuring out ways of uncovering it. And it seems to me that scientific rationality is best thought of as something that is discovered rather than predetermined or predicted. In my first year studying chemistry at Oxford, I specialized in quantum theory, and I soon realized that I had to learn to conform my own thinking to the structure of the universe rather than tell the universe what form it should take, based on what seemed to me to be reasonable. I exaggerate slightly, but we might suggest that rationalism tells the universe what it ought to be like, whereas science allows the universe to answer back and listens to it. You will not need me to tell you how this line of thought is theologically productive and responsible. To give one obvious example, the key question to ask about the doctrine of the Trinity is not, is this reasonable? As Augustine of Hippo pointed out ages ago, the task of theology is not to reduce God to the intellectually manageable and then label that reasonable. It is to expand the vision of the human intellect so that it can grasp as much of God as it can, an idea that's best expressed perhaps with the idea of mystery, namely something that we cannot grasp in its totality. And it seems to me that the task of a responsible Christian theology is to discover the internal logic of the Christian faith, not to lay down in advance what form this should take. But it is a fourth habit of thought that I want to highlight. When confronted with a series of observations, the scientist's fundamental instinct is to try and figure out what big picture or what theory makes the most sense of them. Let's remember that a theory, Greek theoria, is ultimately a way of seeing or beholding things. And although I remain unpersuaded by Martin Heidegger's more adventurous explorations of this theme, like the idea that theory is a kind of sacral beholding, his more modest reflections on the need to see things properly seems to me to be entirely plausible. We might term this style of thinking induction. Or we might turn to the great American philosopher Charles Peirce, himself a scientist, and speak instead of abduction. By abduction, Peirce meant a search for a way of seeing things that fitted in observations naturally and persuasively. Sometimes this arose from intense rational reflection, sometimes by what I can only describe as an imaginative leap. A classic example is Auguste Kekulé's idea that benzene possessed a cyclical structure, which he first set out in a French article of 1865 and then a German article of 1866. Now, Kekulé did not explain the logic of discovery lying behind this idea at that time, although his subsequent work provided an extensive logic of justification for the ring structure of benzene. Yet in 1890, at a celebration marking the 25th anniversary of this suggestion, by then, of course, widely accepted, Kekulé spoke of how this idea came to him, perhaps because his reputation was then beyond reproach. Kekulé felt able to tell his astonished audience of the unorthodox manner by which he developed this idea in the first place. He had had a dream of a snake chasing its own tail. Happily, I may add, Sigmund Freud had yet to develop his own distinctive way of explaining dreams about snakes. But whatever the origins of this idea might be, they're speculative, even mystical, the fact remains that when it was checked out against the evidence, it seemed to work. The manner of its derivation might be opaque, but the manner of its verification was clear and ultimately persuasive. But these historical reflections are little more than a prelude to my main themes this evening. The question I wish to explore in this lecture is this: given the emphasis of the new atheism on the natural sciences as a model for rationality, what response might Christians make? Answering this question allows us an angle of approach to the relation of science and religion, which I believe to be illuminating and helpful, providing its limits are understood and acknowledged. Although this question is given a new prominence by the new atheism, it is important in its own right. And I want to suggest to you that this fourth habit of thought I developed as a scientist, namely looking for the big picture or the best explanation, is both theologically and apologetically significant. Let me emphasize that I make no claim to personal acuity here. My point is simply that this habit of thought is typical of the scientific enterprise and reflects its empirical and evidential orientation. I think that we must recognize that in bringing science and religion into discussion with one another, we are only dealing with a partial encounter. Science and religion can neither be elided nor declared to be non-overlapping magisteria, because there are clearly areas of shared interest and concern, despite important divergences that must be noted and respected. And one of those is a desire to make sense of things. The whole issue of making sense of reality is deeply embedded within both the natural sciences and the Christian faith. Indeed, if I might offer a personal perspective, one factor that led me decisively away from my useful atheism to Christianity was my growing realization that the Christian faith made far more sense of what I saw around me and experienced within me than its atheist alternatives. And I gladly endorse C.S. Lewis's statement, now of course inscribed on his memorial stone in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Yet there is more to Christianity than making sense of things. We can hardly overlook its emphasis on the existentially transformative nature of salvation, nor the rich experience of beauty and awe which is so often experienced in Christian worship. Yet the fact remains that the intellectual capaciousness of faith cannot be overlooked. As a Harvard psychologist, William James, suggested many years ago, religious faith is basically a faith in the existence of an unseen order of some kind in which the riddles of the natural order may be found and explained. Now, I concede that this aspect of Christianity can be overemphasized, leading to an impoverishment of faith. Dorothy L. Sayers, unquestionably one of the finest lay theologians of the 20th century, was convinced that Christianity seemed to offer what she called the only explanation of the universe that is intellectually satisfactory. Yet she subsequently wrote to William Temple, Archbishop of Canterbury, confessing that she was so attractive to this aspect of Christianity that at times she wondered whether, in her words, she had merely fallen in love with an intellectual pattern. And looking back on my own exploration of my faith, I can see this failing, and it is a failing, reflected in my own early thinking. Yet as I grew in faith, its imaginative and aesthetic dimensions became increasingly evident to my mind and increasingly important to my theological articulation. Yet that intellectual foundation remains firmly embedded in my mind, giving structure and stability to everything else that is based on it. Now, at the other end of this spectrum of possibilities, we might note the brilliantly argued critique of the new atheism provided by Terry Eagleton, who was severely critical of those who treat religion as a fundamentally explanatory phenomenon. He writes, Christianity was never meant to be an explanation of anything in the first place. It's rather like saying that thanks to the electric toaster, we can forget about Chekhov. And Eagleton suggests that believing that, I quote, religion is a botched attempt to explain the world is about as helpful as seeing ballet as a botched attempt to run for a bus. Now, it seems to me Eagleton is surely right to argue that there is more to Christianity than an attempt to make sense of things. Yet this explanatory theme is, as Dorothy Sayers rightly appreciated, part of its rich heritage. Christians have always held that their faith makes sense in itself and makes sense of the enigmas and riddles of our experience as well. The gospel, if you like, is an illuminating irradiance that lights up the landscape of reality, allowing us to see things as they really are. And we might think of the French philosopher Simone Weil, who made this point particularly well, and I cite from her. If I light an electric torch at night out of doors, I don't judge its power by looking at the bulb, but by seeing how many objects it lights up. The brightness of a source of light is appreciated by the illumination it projects on non-luminous objects. The value of a religious, or more generally, a spiritual way of life is appreciated by the amount of illumination thrown upon the things of this world. Now, it seems to me that the ability to illuminate reality is an important measure of the reliability of a theory. The best theory is going to be the one that's able to fit in observations and experiences most elegantly, most simply, most comprehensively, and most fruitfully. And this way of approaching things has come to play a significant role in recent Christian apologetics. The approach adopted is not primarily deductive. Instead of saying that there are certain incorrigible conclusions that force us to draw the additional conclusion that God exists, we suggest that the Christian faith is like a good scientific theory. It gathers together or colligates observations and experiences in a manner that is plausible, expansive, and productive. I mentioned Lewis a moment ago, and as many of you will know, Lewis was an atheist as a young man, taking the view that modern science, by which he meant the science of the 1910s, had discredited faith. So what were his reasons for returning to faith after his atheist experimentations? In an unpublished manuscript dating from around 1930, Lewis makes a remarkable statement which I would like to share with you. I am an empirical theist. I arrived at God by induction. Now, this may surprise some of you here tonight, but it fits in perfectly, not simply with the general trajectory of Lewis's intellectual development, but with his apologetic writings of the early 1940s, in which the rationality of faith is treated as a matter of supreme importance. And interestingly, Lewis makes an implicit appeal to a characteristically empirical mode of reflection in explaining the rational basis of his conversion. Yet I must point out that Lewis probably found this way of thinking already expressed in the writings of his great hero, G.K. Chesterton. After his initial agnosticism, Chesterton's spiritual journey took a decisive new turn in 1903. And he published a newspaper article in which he explained why he and many others now regarded Christianity with intense intellectual seriousness. We've returned to it, he wrote, because it is an intelligible picture of a world. And Chesterton realized that testing any theory meant checking it out against observation. He wrote, "The best way to see if a coat fits a man is not to measure both of them, but to try it on." And here's what he says in more detail, talking about Christianity. Numbers of us have returned to this belief, and we've returned to it not because of this argument or that argument, but because the theory, when it is adopted, works out everywhere, because the coat, when it is tried on, fits in every crease. We put on the theory like a magic hat, and history becomes translucent like a house of glass. Now, Chesterton's argument, as you will have seen, is that the Christian vision of reality as a whole, rather than any of its individual components, proves compelling. Individual observations of nature do not prove Christianity to be true. Rather, Christianity validates itself by its ability to make sense of those observations. And Chesterton puts this, I think, rather beautifully. The phenomenon does not prove religion, but religion explains the phenomenon. For Chesterton, a good theory, whether scientific or religious is to be judged by the amount of illumination it offers and its capacity to accommodate what we see in the world around us and what we experience within us. Once more, we note an implicitly inductive approach being adopted to apologetic questions, fitting in well with the habits of thought of many scientists. Now, Chesterton and Lewis are widely regarded as two of the best apologists of the 20th century. And we need to note that they were not writing in reaction against the new atheism or its forebears. Their approach here is not conditioned by circumstances nor provoked by a specific controversy. Neither Chesterton nor Lewis would claim any scientific credentials, yet their inductive mode of thinking is familiar to any scientist. So let's tease out some aspects of this approach and bring some other people into the conversation. First, let's go back to that neat little aphorism of Chesterton's. The phenomenon does not prove religion, but religion explains the phenomenon. So what does Chesterton mean by explain in this context? The late Christopher Hitchens, one of the leading and I think loudest representatives of the new atheism, famously declared that religion explains nothing. However, the rhetorical force of this bold assertion is significantly reduced by Hitchens' failure to explain what he means by explain. So let's explore this point a little further. Let me begin by turning to the writings of William Whewell, one of the greatest early Victorian philosophers of the empirical sciences, whose writings remain luminous and rewarding, even if today few read them. One of Whewell's most interesting reflections concerns the capacity of a good theory to, his word, colligate observations, like a string holding together a group of pearls in a necklace. Whewell held that all observation involves what he calls unconscious inference, in that what is observed is actually unconsciously or automatically interpreted in terms of a set of ideas. Like Bacon before him, Whewell rejected the deficient notion of induction simply as the enumeration of observations. Instead, Whewell developed the idea that induction was a process of reflection that added something essential to this process of enumeration, namely, some kind of organizing principle. In the process of induction, he suggested, and I quote, "There is a new element added to the combination of instances by the very act of thought by which they were combined." Whewell held that this act of thought was to be understood as a process of colligation. That is to say, the mental operation of bringing together a number of empirical facts by, his words, superinducing upon them a way of thinking that unites the facts, holding them together. And for Whewell, this renders them capable of being expressed by a general law which both identifies and illuminates what he called the true bond of unity by which the phenomena are held together. Now, one of the points that emerges from Whewell's perceptive analysis is that a good theory is able to, his word, colligate observations that might up to that point have been regarded as disconnected. We might think, for example, of Newton's theory of gravity as colligating observations which up to that point had been seen as disconnected, such as the falling of an apple to the ground and the orbiting of planets around the sun. And as many of you will know, this idea of explanation of colligation, as of what might otherwise be seen as unrelated and disparate events, underlies Margaret Morrison's recent notion of unitive explanation, which has obvious implications for Christian apologetics. It also underlies the approach known as inference to the best explanation, now widely regarded as the dominant philosophy of science. Now, the rise of the new atheism has led to Christian apologists reaffirming and representing the fundamental reasonableness of the Christian faith and to an appeal to the natural sciences in support of faith, leading to inferential, inductive, or abductive approaches being deployed apologetically. Now, it could be argued that this development is essentially opportunistic and tactical, a response to a short-term need. But I'm not so sure. The cultural changes within England during the late 17th and 18th century made it clear that Christianity had to assert and defend its reasonableness in the public domain if it was to hold its own in an increasingly skeptical world of ideas. And we might think of Bishop Butler's Analogy of Religion, 1736, as a work of apologetics in its own right, but also as a talisman of a church that was willing and able to engage cultural concerns and criticisms relating to its intellectual foundations. Back in the 1960s, in an age of cultural unrest and transition, Austin Farrer made much the same point. Listen to him. I think he's right. Though argument does not create conviction, the lack of it destroys belief. What seems to be proved may not be embraced, but what no one shows the ability to defend is quickly abandoned. Rational argument does not create belief, but it maintains a climate in which belief may flourish. Now, in my view, the rise of the new atheism prompted the church to recover an apologetic tradition that seems to have faltered after the 1960s. And it seems to me that the continued popularity of the apologetic writings of C.S. Lewis, whose books sell more copies today than during his lifetime, is partly a reflection of their merits, but also a reflection of the fact that nobody seems to have emerged as Lewis's obvious successor as a popular Christian apologist. And what I want to highlight in this lecture is the way in which the new atheism's somewhat unsophisticated evidential appeal to science as indicative of atheism is being matched within Christian circles by a rather more sophisticated appeal to the scientific method as supportive of faith. Now, I hope that I will need to offer no justification for my choice of John Polkinghorne to illustrate this approach. I also hope he will need nothing by way of introduction, not least because he wrote, though sadly on account of illness was unable to deliver, the Boyle lecture last year. I first began to read Polkinghorne's works in the early 1980s, and I continue to do so with both profit and admiration. So what approach does he adopt? A number of studies of his approach have picked up on his idea of congruence. This is expressed at a number of levels, including what many of you will recall as his important reflections on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Listen to what he says. Many of you will recognize these words. We are so familiar with the fact that we can understand the world that most of the time we take it for granted. It's what makes science possible. Yet, It could have been otherwise. The universe might have been a disorderly chaos rather than an orderly cosmos, or it might have had a rationality that was inaccessible to us. There is a congruence between our minds and the universe, between the rationality experienced within and the rationality observed without. And Polkinghorne's point is that this congruence requires explanation. We might recall Albert Einstein's famous quip here: the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. So we must ask, what way of looking at things makes sense of that? How can we render intelligibility intelligible? Polkinghorne's answer over the years, increasingly framed in explicitly Trinitarian terms, is that Christianity provides us with a framework that explains what is otherwise a miracle or a most fortunate accident. And in what follows, I want to look at several themes that I discern within Polkinghorne's approach, which seem to me to be both warranted and helpful. To begin with, let's note that Polkinghorne makes a critical and I think important distinction between what critical realists call different levels of explanation. And he uses an analogy which is familiar to the British and endearing to the Americans. Suppose, Polkinghorne suggests, that he decides to make a pot of tea. So he puts a kettle on the gas stove. An observer might see this kettle of water on the stove and ask, why is this water boiling? At one level, the answer is to be framed scientifically. Burning gas generates heat, which is transferred to the water and thus raises the temperature of the water to its boiling point. Yet the question can and surely must be answered at another level as well. The kettle is boiling because Polkinghorne wanted to make a pot of tea. Now, my point here is that both these responses are valid and both are grounded in reality, yet they are not in competition. Indeed, the two explanations complement each other, providing a more complete picture of the whole tea-making enterprise. The two explanations are to be seen, to use Polkinghorne's words, as friends, not foes. Now, why is that point so important? The answer is that the new atheism takes a strongly positivist view of science, holding that it explains or has the potential to explain everything, including matters traditionally regarded as lying within the religious realm. Science and religion, they argue, offer competing explanations. And for the new atheism, science will ultimately triumph, and religious explanations will simply fade away. There cannot be multiple explanations of the same things, and only the scientific explanation can be valid. But I think we can critique that. A scientific explanation of the world describes how it arose from the initial cosmological event we call the Big Bang, which led over a long period of time to the formation of stars and planets, creating conditions favorable to the organization and evolution of living creatures. And in that account, no reference is made, or indeed needs to be made, to God. Yet, the Christian will supplement this account, speaking of God bringing the world into existence and directing it towards its intended outcomes. For some, this process involves direct divine action. For others, it involves creating and working through natural forces to achieve those goals. And my point here is that these two accounts supplement each other rather than contradicting each other. They are not in competition. As Polkinghorne rightly notes, and I quote, "Our goal is an integrated picture of the way the world is." And that means weaving together different levels of explanation to provide a rich and comprehensive whole. Next, we need to look at the question of whether religious faith can be proved. Polkinghorne makes it clear that Christian belief can be regarded as warranted or justified. Yet he insists it's not something that is, or indeed can be, proved. Good reasons can be given for faith, even if these fall short of the rigorous proof that we expect in logic or mathematics. But on further reflection, we realize that this form of rigorous proof is actually limited to logic and mathematics. Let me again quote from Polkinghorne. "Neither science nor religion can entertain the hope of establishing logically coercive proof of the kind that only a fool could deny. No one can avoid some degree of intellectual precariousness." I like that phrase. "And there is a consequent need for a degree of caution in the quest for truth. Experience and interpretation intertwine in an inescapable circularity. Even science cannot wholly escape this dilemma, in that theory interprets experiments, experiments confirm or disconfirm theories." So let me set what Polkinghorne has to say against Richard Dawkins' views set out in The Selfish Gene, on the basis of which he criticizes religious faith in the God delusion. Dawkins argues there is no need for faith in science, in that the evidence for a correct conviction compels us to accept its truth. Let's listen to what Dawkins has to say. "Faith is a state of mind that leads people to believe something, it doesn't matter what, in the total absence of supporting evidence. If there were good supporting evidence, then faith would be superfluous, for the evidence would compel us to believe it anyway." Yet on reflection, this turns out to be an unsustainable view of the relation of evidence and belief in the natural sciences, not least because it fails to make the critical distinction between the total absence of supporting evidence and the absence of totally supporting evidence. For example, consider the current debate within cosmology over whether the Big Bang gives rise to a single universe or a series of universes, the so-called multiverse. Many scientists support the former approach, and equally distinguished scientists support the latter, but both are real options for thinking and informed scientists who make their decisions on the basis of their judgments about how best to interpret the evidence. The issue is that of evidence-based judgments, in which decisions have to be taken on the basis of a less than total apprehension of reality. The issue, if you like, is about justification rather than proof, being able to show that there are good reasons for thinking something is right without the luxury of total confirmation. Polkinghorne thus emphasizes the ability of the Christian faith to make sense of the world, including the successes of the natural sciences. And we see this especially in his 2003 essay, Physics and Metaphysics in a Trinitarian Perspective. And Polkinghorne here argues that a Trinitarian view of reality offers a lens through which the scientific enterprise can be satisfactorily explained. For Polkinghorne, science raises questions which it cannot answer on the basis of its own methods, thus pointing the way to the need for a renewed theological engagement with nature. And this general approach, often in redacted forms, is now encountered widely throughout the Christian community, particularly among natural scientists, who find it to resonate strongly with their working methods and assumptions. Now, thus far, I have commended an appeal to the natural sciences in engaging the new atheism. Yet I need to add a little more texture and depth to this discussion. We must, I think, appreciate that the use of such scientific approaches to apologetics is not without risk. To appreciate this point, let's reflect further on the original Boyle lectures of the 1690s and early 1700s. And while these lectures are of interest to historians for many reasons, one of their most intriguing features is how that they demonstrate that critiques of Christianity often determine the shape of the Christian response, and hence a broader cultural perception of what Christianity actually is. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. Any attempt to describe Christianity properly would have to take into account its rational, moral, and aesthetic dimensions, recognizing that it is a multifaceted phenomenon which is surprisingly resistant to reductionist accounts of either its identity or significance. Yet, the skeptical criticisms of Christianity of the early Augustan age primarily challenged its intrinsic rationality. And in response, the apologists of that landmark age reasserted and defended the rationality of their faith, concentrating on meeting certain specific cognitive objections, rather than setting out a full vision of their faith, indicating as appropriate how this related to the controversies of their day. Now, at one level, this is an entirely sound rhetorical strategy, in that objections are seen to be engaged and to be met. But I must suggest it also unintendedly creates the impression that Christianity is simply a rational belief system. And this, I think I must insist, is an impoverished view of Christianity. In other words, a defensible apologetic strategy thus unintentionally creates a misleading or an impoverished perception of what Christianity is all about. And I see a similar trend in today's responses to the new atheism. The new atheists, especially Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, launched a critique of Christianity which focused on its alleged rational and moral defects. And Christian apologists responded by meeting these rational and moral concerns point by point. Yet with hindsight, we can see that the new atheism set the terms of that debate, in effect determining the battleground. And that's why I think the initial new atheist critique served to crystallize so many popular perceptions about the nature of Christianity. If we were to judge Christianity by the manner in which it's presented in refutations of the new atheism, I think it would be found to be excessively rational, lacking any real concern for beauty, just to mention one point. And here I think I must, in all honesty, concede my own complicity in this very unhelpful development. But things are now changing, and the waning of media interest in the new atheism and in the public credibility of its approach now allows us a much fuller a much more authentic public articulation of the nature and characteristics of Christianity. The new atheism raised some very good questions without providing satisfactory answers. The debate and the discussion continues. And the huge public interest in the 50th anniversary of the death of C.S. Lewis partly reflects his rich imaginative vision of the Christian faith. If I might quote Austin Farrer again, Lewis's remarkable success as an apologist was partly due to his ability, and I quote, to offer a positive exhibition of the force of Christian ideas, morally, imaginatively, and rationally. So I must conclude, not because I've exhausted my subject, but simply because we're running out of time. The Boyle lectures, as originally conceived, were concerned with engaging the questions raised within the increasingly skeptical culture of the Augustan age in England, and in particular demonstrating the intrinsic rationality of the Christian faith within an emerging scientific culture. I believe that this task needs to be continued, and I see plenty of encouraging signs that this is taking place, not least this impressive new series of Boyle lectures here at St. Mary Le Bow. In this lecture, I've noted some of the themes and characteristics of these responses, as well as identifying a few points of concern that seem to need further consideration as the discussion progresses. But I would like, if I may, to end on a personal note. As I think you know, I shall be taking up the Andreas Idrius Professorship of Science and Religion at Oxford University in a few weeks' time. And I have the privilege of succeeding two distinguished historians, John Hedley Brooke and Peter Harrison, who have made landmark contributions to the field of science and religion. And during its first phase, the Idrius Chair has become associated with outstanding research and teaching in the field of science and religion. Yet for the reasons I've outlined in this lecture, I've concluded that the Idrius Chair, without losing its vital focus on excellence in teaching and research, must also be a chair of public engagement. That is to say, it must become a focus for engagement with the issues about science and religion that are being asked right now within our culture and not simply within the academy. And it seems to me that we need to think more about the public dissemination and cultural interpretation of knowledge and research, and not simply its academic generation. I believe that this can be done, but ladies and gentlemen, I also know that it needs to be done. Thank you so much for listening.
My first very welcome duty is to thank Alistair on behalf of us all for a wonderful lecture. Clear in language and clear in theme, he's drawn on his wide reading in science and religion to illuminate a contemporary issue of great importance. We could not have been better served. Thank you, Alistair. In my response, I want to make 4 points, which are also in the nature of questions. Vast issues which I'll have to state with absurd brevity. First, Alistair stressed that science proceeds on the basis of induction, the collation of observed phenomena in order to explore how they might fit together in a wider picture, and he suggests that this is not dissimilar to theological method. But I always understood that at the heart of science, this wider picture arrived at by observation also enables us to make assertions or predictions that can be tested in practice for their truth or falsity. And this gave rise to a great debate in the 1950s about whether theological assertions could be put to the test in a similar way. If not, it was suggested that they were meaningless. This resulted in the attempts of people like John Hick to affirm the idea of eschatological verification. So the first question in my mind is about whether or not the ability to make assertions that can be tested out is a fundamental aspect of scientific method, and if it is, what are the implications for theological method? Secondly, in referring to the idea of a big picture which makes most sense of things, Alistair says, the best theory is the one that is able to fit in observations and experiences most elegantly, most simply, most comprehensively, and most fruitfully. He described how he, as well as C.S. Lewis, found that the Christian faith did indeed do this for them. I'd want to suggest, however, that whatever may be the case in science, when it comes to a wider worldview about the nature of life as a whole, making sense of things cannot of itself tell us whether or not that view is true. It might hold things together in a wonderful, elegant, unified pattern and still not be true. Now, I hold this position because of what I've always understood Kant's arguments against the traditional arguments for the existence of God to entail. Quite simply, we don't know whether the kind of reasoning which we know works in helping us to understand phenomena within the world is applicable to the universe as a whole. To assume that it does, to assume, for example, that because nothing in this life happens without a cause or causes, there must be an uncreated cause for the universe to be here in the first place, is simply to beg the question. Similarly, we can create big pictures relating to scientific phenomena that make sense of the multiple facts within the world, but it doesn't follow that there is a rational purpose for the existence of a universe or a multiverse itself. And it seems to me that the implication of this is that we can never say for certain, from a totally impartial point of view, whether the universe is the product of a rational purpose or is a tale of sound and fury signifying nothing. We simply don't know one way or the other. And there's nothing sinister about this. It's just that we have a limited human's eye view of the world. It's hugely satisfying to believe that the universe as a whole makes sense. But from a strictly detached point of view, I suggest we simply don't know. Now, thirdly, I do believe that things can be held together in an all-embracing explanation of life's meaning and purpose, but only on the basis of the Christian faith as a whole. Indeed, I know that Alistair would wholeheartedly agree with this, as he was very careful to affirm that the kind of issue he was concerned with in this great lecture tonight, though very important, must not be seen apart from wider Christian issues. And I emphasize the Christian faith as a whole because I suspect that for most people, the central issue for faith is not its alleged incompatibility with science, but the incompatibility of life as we know it with the idea of a just and loving creation. Last week it was reported that before he died, Mikhail Kalashnikov, the designer of the deadly killing weapon, the AK-47 that bears his name, wrote to the Patriarch of Moscow in great spiritual torment because he felt responsible for the deaths of millions who died as a result of armed groups in every part of the world using his design. As he wrote, "The longer I live, the more this question drills itself into my brain, and the more I wonder why the Lord allowed man the devilish desires of envy, greed, aggression. Yes, an increasing number of churches and monasteries in our land, and yet evil does not decrease." Or as another Russian, a fictional one, Ivan Karamazov, put it, It's not God I don't believe in, Alyosha. It's just that I return him my ticket. I used to enjoy teasing Richard Dawkins by saying, Richard, there's so many good arguments against religion. Why do you keep dragging science into it? I believe that these arguments, this challenge presented by the character of life, can only be lived with, not finally solved, with the full panoply of the Christian faith. Faith that God himself shares in human anguish to the full in Christ, his resurrection, and its fulfillment in an eternal order in which the loving purpose of divine love prevails and suffuses all things. That, for me, is the only way life can be seen to have a logic to it, but it's the logic, of course, of love, of divine wisdom. Yet, as I argued for my third point, just because it makes sense for me in that way, it doesn't mean to say that it's true. So I come on to my fourth and last point. Alistair mentioned that Austin Farrer had been a very big influence on him, and indeed quoted him with approval. He, together with Donald Mackinnon in a very different way and Reinhold Niebuhr in the application of the Christian faith to the political order, have been the biggest influences on my theological thinking, and Farrer probably the biggest. And the paradox of Farrer is that though he was described as the one genius produced by the Church of England in the 20th century, he flowered in his less technical writings at the end of his life, not least in his sermons. Out of each one, some theologians, said C.S. Lewis, a great admirer of Farrer, put it, would have made a whole book. Farrer wrote what must be the most remarkable Lent book ever written, 127 tiny pages entitled A Science of God, ? In which he reflects on the process of evolution and on how, if at all, we can see God in the process. He takes his cue from a saying of Thomas Aquinas: practical science studies things we can work, but God is not to be worked by us. On the contrary, we men are God's work. Farrer wrote once about creation, because we have God under the root of our being, we can't help but acknowledge him at the root of all the world's being. The Christian believes that her being is moment by moment held in existence by the fount of all being, that she is utterly dependent on the ground of all that exists, and so, therefore, is everything else. And if this is the believer's personal experience, she can't help but acknowledge the same power as the ground of the length and breadth of the universe, including multiverses, if there is a multiverse, including its origin ex nihilo 13.5 billion years ago. Secondly, as Farrer put it, to make you or me, God must make half a universe. A man's body and a man's mind form a focus in which a world is concentrated and drawn into a point. It may be in that point that I know existence, but it is an existence which involves the world. And again, if we are concerned about a creative cause, it's because in creating all things, he is creating us. And it concerns us to enter into the making of our souls and of one another's. To enter into the action of God, thus, is what we mean by religion. And it is something we do. It is a matter of experience. In short, a believer seeks to align their life with the divine illumination and leading, but because we exist as the product of evolution, that divine illumination and leading has been present at every point in the whole process. We read back from our own interaction with the divine will that there is a divine will working in and through all secondary causes, all those causes that can be mapped out so well by scientific exploration. The divine leading cannot, of course, be located by scientific scrutiny, but the religious believer who claims to be aware of this will in their own life cannot but help posit this will at the basis of all life, cannot help in the sense that consistency of thought demands it. R.S. Thomas gets the paradoxical nature of that divine leading in a late poem when he writes, to yield to an unfelt pressure that, irresistible in itself, had the character of everything but coercion. It's described as a pressure, but unfelt. It's described as irresistible, but it has the character of everything but coercion. In this way, as Farrar put it, we acquire experimental acquaintance with the work of God. By the same process of mind, we can come to see that a faith that makes sense of my personal life is a faith that makes sense of life as a whole. The big picture painted by the mind is rooted in a daily life and practice, and that practice illuminates life as a whole. Induction in science collates many observations to form a big picture which can be tested out in the laboratory. Induction in theology collates not only observations of how the world works, but insights of living and disclosure to form a big picture of God that can be tested in personal experience. For God is not to be worked by us, said Farrar. On the contrary, we are God's works. So with that, I'd just finally like to thank Alistair, and it's been a great pleasure to listen to you and to be in this church again. I was fortunate enough to know Joseph McCulloch here 50 years ago, and he was a good friend and a huge influence on my life. I sat at his feet for 6 years at Hampstead when I was a curate, because he preached there every Sunday. And when he was having all these dialogues with the celebrities of his time, the Bishop of London at the time, with a wonderful dry sense of humour, said about Joseph's ministry in this church, "Oh, one link with the outside world." Well, I like to think that we have more links with the outside world now, and Alistair is certainly one of the major links with that particular world. Thank you, Alistair.
With very warm and appreciative thanks both to Alistair McGrath and Richard Harris, I'm delighted to announce that the 12th Boyle Lecture will take place here on the 25th of February 2015, and the board is pleased to announce, in keeping with a principle that we will look overseas 1 year in 3, that the speaker will be Professor Robert Russell. Bob Russell is founder and director of the Centre for Theology and the Natural Sciences and serves as the Ian Barber Professor of Theology and Science at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. A prolific author in the field of science and theology, Bob Russell has also co-edited a multi-volume series of books examining scientific perspectives on divine action through an international research conference program co-sponsored by his institute and by the Vatican Observatory. This major project questioned possible modes of divine action. Dr. Russell has served on the John Templeton Foundation Board of Advisors since its inception and is a co-editor of the journal Theology and Science, a PhD in experimental physics, as well as having master's degrees in divinity, arts, and science. He is ordained in the United Church of Christ and a member of the Society of Ordained Scientists. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.